All right, hello everyone. My name is Rosa. I have been living with type 1 diabetes for 15 years, and I have been a participant of DYF programs for 15 years as well. I love Diabetes Camp, and I'm so excited to see so many new faces and get to know all of you. This is awesome. This session is Tips and Tricks for Tandem Control IQ with Dr. Lisa Norlander. Dr. Lisa is awesome. She has lots of knowledge to share with us, and I wear a Tandem, so I'm super excited to learn. If you have questions, we can send them through the chat, and I can either say them out loud for you or let Dr. Lisa know that you have a question, and then you can unmute and ask. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Lisa.
All right. Yes, so yeah, feel free to ask any questions. I have tried to sort of put a wide breadth of information into this talk. So, there may be things that need more explanation or anything like that. So feel free if you don't understand a concept or if anything, just please feel free to interrupt and ask, or put a chat in a question in the chat box, and then Rosa will look at that. Now, so just so that I have an idea, I guess you guys can sort of raise your hand. How many of you already have a Tandem pump using Control IQ? So just about everybody. So is there anyone that it does not have a Tandem pump that is thinking about it? Okay. Alrighty. So, this talk will hopefully be able to sort of span both of those. So again, I guess I'll just do a little bit more of an introduction. My name is Lisa Norlander, and I actually sort of started coming to camp when I was in medical school. That was, oh goodness, 13 years ago or so, and just really, really enjoyed meeting people in the community and all of that. And so I've been coming back ever since. And through that connection with camp, I started working at Stanford with Dr. Bruce Buckingham, if any of you are familiar with him. He does a lot of closed loop research. And so that's why just everything about the Tandem Control IQ, as you'll see, I'll talk a little bit about sort of the research process, is something that we've been doing for a long time at Stanford. So let me see, I'm gonna share my screen. I tried to make the slides so that if you keep people's pictures, or if you want to have my picture, if you keep it over sort of on the right side of your screen, you should be able to see most of the content on the slides. So again, this is going to be a talk about Tandem Control IQ, just tips and tricks, and also some of the research behind it that went into building this algorithm. So a lot of these slides are from Dr. Bruce Buckingham as well as Dr. Laya Eltzesbor, who are the two sort of main doctors that work on our team at Stanford. So first of all, we need to sort of set a framework. So an automated insulin delivery system is sort of what these are becoming called. So, but you can hear a lot of different names for them. You'll hear artificial pancreas, you'll hear closed loop control, you'll hear a bunch of different names. And essentially all this is you have let me see if I can use a pointer. So you've got your CGM. So in the case that we'll be talking about, this is going to be your Dexcom. And that talks to a pump, and on the pump there is some sort of a controlling algorithm. And all of the different systems out there have some differences between them. So I'm going to talk sort of about what some of those differences are and how that relates to the Tandem Control IQ system. So first of all, the algorithm on all of the pumps that are currently available is that they will automatically calculate insulin delivery based on what the glucose level is, but we call it hybrid closed loop control because it's not fully automatic. You still need to actually give boluses for meals. So when we talk about what we would consider to be complete or full closed loop, that would be when you don't actually have to give any boluses. So to go into a little bit of the history of Control IQ, back in 2012, this was a couple of years before I joined the team, they were already starting to work on this. So just to see sort of how long things come, because Control IQ didn't get approved for adults until essentially sort of the beginning of this year, or the end of last year. And so, you know, I mean, we've been working on all of these systems for a very long time. Initially, we had the Dexcom 7 Plus, and then went to the G4, and then an insulin pump, which was the Roche pump. And it was all, we had a bunch of like large cell phones or iPads that people would have to carry around to control it. That then in 2015, we got to sort of a more of a streamlined approach through something called Type 0. So this was all developed over at the University of Virginia, and they worked in close conjunction with Stanford to sort of put all this together. And finally, we have the system that we know today. So I just want to make a little key point that CAMP has been integral in creating these systems. So this is actually, we took all of this to CAMP with us to be able to do some of the earliest trials on the closed loop system. And so this is a group of our team set up, we would set up in one of the buildings. So not actually at Bearskin, but we did do this at Camp de los Niños. And we would sort of monitor all of the kids. And then we would look at these dashboards. And so when you see someone that was going low, then we would send one of our staff out, and they would have to go and find this kid in the middle of their activity and treat them for their glucose levels. So through that entire process, we get to what we have now, which is the Tandem, the T-Slim X2 pump using the Control IQ technology. So again, you need to have a Tandem X2, the pump, and then to get the Control IQ, one of the unique things that only the Tandem system as of right now does is that you actually can update it through simply a software update. So you don't have to get an entirely new pump in order to get the newest version. And that, again, is working with the G6. The nice thing, I'm sure that the majority of you know, is no calibrations required. And so a big advancement, I think, for CGM technology. So we did a 6-month pivotal trial. So essentially, anytime you want to get something to go sort of through the FDA, you have to do one of these really big trials that has hundreds of participants. And so we did this 6-month trial. And what we found is what we did was we compared sort of the standard of care, which was just using a CGM and a pump that they could communicate, but there wasn't the automatic insulin delivery system, comparing that to the closed loop or the hybrid closed loop arm. And so essentially what we found is in every sort of metrics that we looked at, so time and range, and I'll show you more slides of this, pretty much everything showed that across all of the different levels, everything sort of got better when you had closed loop control. So this was a slide of it. So if you look at the blue marks are all the people that had stayed on sort of the just getting a CGM with the regular pump, and then the red is the closed loop control. So the Control IQ. So what you can see at baseline, the two groups were fairly similar. There was a slight bit of improvement just at baseline of the group that was in the closed loop control group. But over every single month, we saw a pretty significant difference between the groups. This slide is a little bit complicated. So what you're looking at is a graph of the time of day. So over here is midnight, and then it goes all the way to midnight over on this side. And what this is looking at is the amount of time over the entire study that people kept that they were within the time and range. So again, we're talking about time and range was considered to be 70 to 180. And so what you can see, and what's sort of the most striking about this, is all the way along, the people that were in closed loop at every hour of the day were doing better than the group that was just using the pump and CGM. But the biggest difference is nighttime. And we know this because overnight, you don't have all of the inputs, like you're not eating, you're not exercising, you're not doing all of the things that can sort of change the glucose levels. And so that's where we saw this huge improvement. You know, you can just see that the time and range, you know, approaches 100%. It was in the 90s for sort of this over the night time frame. So, you know, just right there sort of is one of the biggest advantages of when you're looking at the entire 24 hours, the biggest advantage comes to using this overnight. And then this is the last sort of graph that I'm going to show. But essentially, this looks at what were people's hemoglobin A1Cs when they started the system and how they improved. And what we saw was that at every single hemoglobin A1C level, when people started, they saw improvement. So even if people were, you know, doing sort of a really diligent job of trying to get their glucose levels in range and had an A1C that was less than 6.5, they still saw an improvement from going to this controlled IQ. We did, however, like the biggest differences are sort of in the higher levels.
Hey, Dr. Lisa, there's a question.
Yes.
About the graph on 2 slides ago. Yes, this one. Was it done with people using the sleep mode or the activity mode? And I assume that's on the tandem insulin pump, how there's the different modes that you can set it in.
So we're going to talk a lot more about the different modes, but in general, this, for the most part, our protocol for this study was to set everybody up with the sleep mode. And then people had the ability to turn the exercise mode on and off based on when they were exercising. So this does, I mean, there's a couple situations, and we'll talk about that, when people weren't using the sleep mode, but in general, this is predominantly sleep mode. Any other questions?
Yeah, there was one more. This might pertain to later in the presentation, but the Freestyle Libre sensor and whether or not that can be used with the Tandem Control IQ system.
Yeah, as of right now, it cannot. So the only sensor that can work with the system is essentially the Dexcom. Yeah. All right. So now to talk a little bit more about the algorithm that is on the Dexcom, or excuse me, on the pump. So there's sort of 2 different parts of it, if you think about it. So there's the hypoglycemia prevention. And so what this does is it says, as your glucose is going down, it's going to either decrease or completely stop the amount of insulin you're getting. And I'll explain sort of the different levels and when it's doing this, but it basically is trying to stop things to prevent you from going low. On the opposite side is the hyperglycemia safety. And so it works in a couple of different ways. The first way is that you're going to increase the amount of basal you're getting. Sorry, I'm getting some So you're going to, it's going to increase your basal. And then also one of the things that was new on this system that was different than, say, the Medtronic system that's out there is it actually gives you automated correction boluses. And I'm going to go into that more as well. And then the third part is that this sleep mode is a new mode for these types of pumps. And it intensifies the control overnight, knowing that you don't have as many other inputs in it. Now, so again, just one of the things is, you know, the little point at the bottom, you still have to be able to give yourself boluses, and sorry, CHO is carbohydrates. So you still have to give yourself a bolus for any carbohydrate that you take in. Okay.
Dr. Lisa, there's a question.
Yes.
So why increase the basal insulin versus giving a bolus?
I will actually talk to that in this next slide.
Okay.
So basically what this system is doing is it is looking at a prediction of where the system thinks your glucose is going to be in 30 minutes, okay? So what it does is if it thinks that your glucose is going to be above 180, so this top bar, that is when it's going to start giving these auto corrections. And so these are boluses that are going to happen automatically. You don't need to do anything to have them happen. So what it's going to do is it's going to look at what your glucose is, how much insulin on board you have, and then it's going to give you a bolus that is 60% of the amount that you would need to get yourself down to 110. Okay, so it's not going to give you a full bolus because it still, again, it doesn't know all of the details of what's going on in your life. So it wants to be safe, but it wants to give you 60% of that. Okay, it's going to, this will be based on your profile, the settings that you have in your pump, but I'll go into that a little bit later because there are some caveats. And it's going to give this a maximum of once per hour. So it's not as if at every hour on the hour, it's going to say, oh, it's time for a bolus. It's going to be evaluating every 5 minutes when it gets that new data. And it's going to say, oh, has it been more than an hour since my last bolus, and should I, you know, do you need another bolus? So if you are 220 but you are coming down and the system predicts that you are going to be less than 180 in the next 30 minutes, it's not going to give you a bolus. Versus if you're 150 and it predicts that you'll be above 180 in the next 30 minutes, and then it will give you a bolus in that case. So that's why there's not sort of a hard cutoff, because it's all based on this prediction model. So that's at above the 180. Now, if you are above 160, so anywhere above 160, so even if you're above the 180 mark, it is also going to be increasing, sort of ratcheting up your basal. So it's going to, this is sort of just, so the reason that they do this and that they sort of ratchet up the basal is they want to have something that's a little bit more conservative and a little bit safer. So every 5 minutes, it's taking into this information and saying, well, yeah, it still predicts you to be up above 160. We're going to give you a little bit more insulin, because it doesn't want to give you so much insulin that it makes you crash. So that's why there's sort of these two different pieces where it's going to be increasing the basals as well as giving these correction boluses. Now, if you are between 112.5 and 160, it's not, the system is not going to do anything. It essentially is just going to use the settings that you have programmed in your pump. It's going to use the basals and just go with those settings. Sorry, Rosa, did somebody have a question? I can't actually see the questions, so I really appreciate you telling me.
No, I don't think anyone has any questions.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, one just popped up. The closed loop system / details are new to me. Is there a way to go back? Okay. Scott, I'm actually recording the session, and we can get you a link for the recording. That way you can go back and review the first few slides.
And I'm also more than willing to talk to anybody, or if people have specific questions and want to sort of take it offline, because I know that it is a lot of information if this is all brand new. So I can go through and just explain things in more detail if people want, sort of at the end. So going back to this slide, now if you drop below 112, then the system is going to start decreasing your basal rates. Okay, so, and again, this is based on the prediction. So if it predicts that you are going to be below 112, then it will go ahead and decrease the amount of insulin you get. And if you're predicted to go below 70, then it's going to actually stop the insulin altogether, okay? I have another slide that shows this a little bit, but I just want to show these are the icons that you see on your pump. So when you have closed loop control going, and I'll show you where this is on the pump, you'll see this diamond. And then you can get a lot of information. If the diamond, it looks like the center one where it's just sort of all gray, you know that Control IQ is working, but you're just getting your regular amount of basal. You're not getting more, you're not getting less. And then it shows you if you have this blue with it sort of pointing up, you know you're getting more. And if you have the yellow pointing down, you're getting less. And if it's red, it is stopped. And then also there's a place, and I'll show you this on the pump, where you actually have a B in a box, and that gives you the same information. It tells you, is your bolus or is your basal rate going or not?
So Dr. Lisa, there's a question about if your blood sugar is under 70 and your basal insulin has been stopped, for how long does it stop the insulin?
So this is where it gets a little bit confusing, because you'll actually get alarms. And so a lot of it has to do with whether or not you respond to those alarms. So the Medtronic pumps had like very hard cutoffs on when they would stop. They said, okay, you can't be less than this for X amount of time. And with Tandem, it's a lot more nuanced. So they don't have a set amount of time, because if you essentially tell the pump, like, okay, I understand I'm low, I'm going to eat carbs, then it's going to sort of reset its system because it's expecting you to come up. Okay, so here's just again going to that, what those different icons mean. Can you see it when I move my pointer?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So over here on this side of the pump, this is where you see that little Control IQ diamond. And so again, this one is, they have decreased the insulin, because you can see over here, you're with your CGM value at 116. They say, well, they think that you're going to go below 112 in the next 30 minutes. So they have decreased the amount of insulin. That also corresponds to this B up here has turned yellow, so that you know that the basal rate has been decreased, okay? So the same thing will go for all of these different settings. The biggest difference is over here, if you get down to red, this turns to a 0. So you can see on this slide, it's the red 0 telling you that you don't have any insulin going. The other thing that will happen is if you, and I'm sorry I don't have a picture of it, if you don't have any insulin going, it actually will put a red streak that is the entire up and down through the entire graph. So you can actually look back and you can see, based on all of the sort of streaking of the red lines in there, when you didn't have any insulin. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about these auto corrections, because this is one of the new features that is just available commercially on the Control IQ pump. So again, it gives it once every hour. Now, here is the important thing to remember about this, is that if you just gave yourself a bolus for food, it counts that as a bolus. Or if you just gave yourself a correction, it will count that as a bolus, and it is not going to give you another correction for at least an hour. Okay, so even if you just ate 5 grams of carbs and you gave yourself an insulin for that those 5 grams, and then you decide to eat another 100 grams and forgot to give yourself any more insulin, it won't give you any of these correction boluses, even if your glucose level is skyrocketing, until it's been at least an hour from the last time you had any sort of a bolus. So again, it's going to do it based on a 30-minute prediction of when your CGM is going to be above 180. And it's going to deliver 60% of your correction dose, again, to get you down to 110. It does this without alerting the user. So you don't get an alarm. All you'll get is the feeling of the pump delivering a bolus, but it doesn't tell you anything about it. So you also have to understand that they have the safety mechanisms that is worked into the pump. It makes it so that you have a maximum amount of insulin that you can be given. So there's a sort of a whole bunch of calculations that go on that tell it what is the maximum amount of insulin that you can get. But the one thing to note is that the pump wants to use the correction factors that you have programmed into the pump, okay? So, but it wants to make sure that that is in a safe range, because you could put anything into your correction factors and it may not actually match with what is based on the amount of insulin that you use. So in the sort of medical field, we have these principles, and some people will use what we call the 1500 rule or the 1800 rule. And so what that means is you take 1500 or you take 1800 and you divide it by your total daily insulin. So when you see here, this is 1500 divided by your total daily insulin. And that gives us an approximate range for what your correction factor should be. And by a correction factor, we're talking about 1 unit should drop you how many points. So what this pump does is it looks and it says, okay, the correction factor that you have programmed into your pump, does it fall in this range between 1500 divided by your daily insulin and 1800 divided by your total daily insulin? If it falls in that range, then the pump uses that number. If it doesn't, then the pump calculates a new correction factor for you when it needs to do this, okay? So when it's looking at, just one other point about the total daily insulin, when it is trying to look at the total daily insulin, what it does is it takes the 6 days prior, and then it has sort of this fading memory. So it's going to give more weight to what your insulin needs were yesterday than it does what your insulin needs were 6 days ago. And this is really helpful because say you get sick and all of a sudden your insulin needs increase, or say you just did a really significant workout and your insulin needs are decreasing, it sort of gives more weight to what has happened just in the last day or two than what happened previously. It also takes into account how much insulin you have on board. And then they have put in this safety sort of unit. The pump is just, they say, okay, we're working with people with type 1 diabetes who generally need sort of lower amounts. And then it said that they're concerned that over 6 units is just getting into too much, and they think that that may potentially cause some people to significantly crash. So that's a safety mechanism that they have in there. Yes, questions? No, okay. So again, here is what the pump will look like. If you are in the middle of getting an auto correction bolus, what you will see down at the bottom is the bolus, and then it goes through with the 3 dots, and it says Control IQ, and it tells you how much insulin you're getting. The only way to stop this, if you don't want this, is to notice it during this and press the little X, and then it will cancel it, and you'll only get however much insulin you've got sort of initially. The other things, again, here is you can tell here that your basal is being increased, and it also puts up this little bolus symbol up here saying that you're getting auto corrections, okay? Okay, next thing I want to talk about is your carbohydrate to insulin ratios. And this is one of the first ways that you can sort of try to change things by using a closed loop controller that can be really helpful. So one of the things that we have realized is that you can actually be more aggressive with your insulin ratios, because it is going to give you the insulin up front. And then if you start to come down on the tail end, it actually is smart enough to sort of pull back on that insulin so that you don't get as much sort of on your tail end. So it's referred to as sort of super bolusing. And obviously there's a lot that needs to go into this. You do need to sort of try it. It's a trial and error type of thing. But so what we'll see if you look down here at the bottom, so if somebody has usual carb ratios where they have 9 grams for 1 unit of insulin at breakfast and 11 grams through the rest of the day, one of the things that you can try is that you can say, okay, well, you can decrease that and maybe say, let's do 8 grams in the morning and 10 grams through the rest of the day. And so knowing that you have a little bit more protection on the back end, and so hopefully helping it so that you don't get quite the rises after you do with the meals. So also thinking about meal bolusing, you still need to be giving your meal boluses before you eat. That is the way all of these systems are meant to work, and that is how they do work the best. So one of the things that Dr. Bruce Buckingham will often say is, if you look at what your glucose is, and then you take the last number off, so say your glucose is 230, so you take off that 0 and then you have 23, then you should give your bolus approximately 23 minutes before you eat anything. If you're 170, then you would take off the 0 and you've got 100, or you have 17, and you try to take your bolus approximately 17 minutes before you eat. Obviously, it's not something that is totally scientific, and it does depend a lot on what you're eating. If you're eating a much higher sort of protein meal, or you're eating a lot of fat with it and you know that it's going to be a slower meal, you may not want to bolus sort of so far in advance. But just as a way to sort of think about it, you know, the lower your glucose is, the less time you want in between when you gave your bolus or when you gave your bolus and when you start eating. Now, this pump does have the option of doing an extended bolus, but it will only basically extend up to 2 hours. That is the maximum that you can do. So again, this is helpful though for some of those high fat meals. So if you are going to be eating something like pizza, or for some people sushi, or you know, some of these meals, and you know that if you give yourself all of your insulin up front, you tend to go low because the carbohydrates are still sitting in your stomach being digested and haven't been let into your blood system yet. So doing the extended bolus, and again, you can choose how much you want to give up front. You can choose to give 50% up front. You can choose to give 10% up front, whatever you want, and then extend the rest out up to 2 hours. So what do you do if you forget to give a meal bolus? Because this is where these systems are a little bit different, because I mean, obviously we all know this happens. It happens to everyone. So what I suggest is this: if you realize like, oh my goodness, I forgot to give myself a bolus, the first thing you do is you look at your pump. Is your glucose starting to go up? If your glucose has not started to go up yet, you can go ahead and give yourself the full meal bolus. okay? Now, if your glucose has started to go up, and so you know that the pump has started to increase the amount of basal that you're getting, then what you can do is you can say, okay, you look at how much insulin you have on board. So how much has the pump already given you? And then you can dial in your carbs and then subtract the amount of insulin that the pump has already given you from the amount that it wants to give you from your carbs. Or being a little bit, even being a little bit more conservative and a little bit more than what the insulin it's already given you. Now, if you look at your pump and you realize it has already given you an auto correction, this is where you have to be really, really careful, because if it gives you an auto correction and then you give yourself the full amount of insulin for the carbs you've just eaten, you will likely go low, because the system is built on trying to ramp up when your glucose is going up. And so if it is already ramping up and then you give yourself this big bolus of insulin, it's going to make you come down. So next thing to talk about is the insulin action time. So for this pump, it is set at 5 hours. You cannot change this. That's just what it is. Not too much I have to say. Also the downside is when you look at your insulin on board, you have no idea how much longer that insulin is going to be working for. So if you see 2 units down there, you don't know, did I just get the 2 units and it's going to be calculated into all these calculations for the next 5 hours? Or was it that I had a big bolus and I only have 1 hour left with these 2 units? So it's one of the criticisms of the pump, but not much we can do about it right now. Temporary basals. So for those of you that use other pumps, temporary basals are something that a lot of people use, particularly in exercise. For this system, you actually have to stop Control IQ to be able to use a temporary basal. So let's talk a little bit more about these targets. So when you are awake, the target that it is shooting for is between 112 and sorry, that should be 112.5, not 0.6, and 160. So again, it's going to use this 30-minute prediction, and it's going to decrease if you're predicted to go below 112. It's going to stop if you're predicted to go below 70, and it's going to increase if you're predicted to go above 160. So where this gets to be important is when we think about sleep, because the sleep mode function changes that range. So instead of it being 112 to 160, it now says you are shooting for 112 to 120. So this very narrow range, but it actually shuts off the automatic correction doses. So it's no longer giving you boluses. It is simply using the basal modulation in order to bring you down. And its goal is that it wants to bring you down within 5 hours. So sleep mode is not something you want to use if you're just taking a nap or something like that. It is really meant for overnight, over about 5 hours, to sort of slowly nudge your insulin or your glucose down into this range. Okay, so that is why, that one of the key differences between the awake mode and the sleep mode. A couple of other things. You can have different sleep times for every day of the week. So if you say, you know what, during the week, I usually go to bed at this time and I wake up at this time, but on weekends, I stay up really late and I get up really late, it can be changed. That pattern can. So this is going to be one of my other tips, this next point. So we recommend you actually extend your sleep time till 1 hour past when you eat breakfast. So if you eat breakfast at 7 a.m., you actually want to extend your sleep time till 8 a.m. And this is why. So the way that the sleep works is it's trying to get you to a lower target. So let's say you have been sort of coasting along at around 100 overnight. That means you've actually had decreased insulin for the amount of time sort of when you're sleeping. So when you wake up, And then all of a sudden, if you wake up and you go back to those wake settings, it has now made it so that it thinks up to 160 is fine. So it's not going to be giving you, if it has successfully gotten you into this 112 to 120 range or lower, when you wake up, it's not going to be giving you any additional insulin. And we all know that breakfast is the meal that tends to cause people to sort of go the highest. So if now you're going into breakfast without a lot of insulin on board, it sort of makes that problem worse of the highs after the meal. So, and the reason we say to extend it 1 hour past your breakfast time is because we know that with auto corrections, if you gave yourself a bolus for breakfast, then it will not give you another bolus for an entire hour. So waiting and having the more aggressive target range of 112 to 120 in that first hour after you eat, so basically all the way from when you wake up to when you eat breakfast to when you would be eligible for another auto bolus, keeping yourself in the more aggressive target range is better. So that's the first tip. Second tip is if you are using exercise mode, which I will talk about in just a moment, sleep mode gets canceled. Exercise mode always trumps sleep mode. So if you have exercised in the evening and you forget to turn off exercise mode, it is just going to carry on for the entire night and you will not go into sleep mode, okay? So if you can see this little, the little picture, so again, this just shows sleep mode. You can click it to start. So obviously it can be automatic or you can do it manually. When you are in sleep mode, you're going to see this Z. And just a reminder, if you see this when you are going to bed, you have not exited your exercise mode. And if you are in exercise mode and you have to exit it, you have to manually turn on sleep mode if it's after the time that sleep mode would normally go on. So if sleep mode normally turns on at 10, but you forget and it's 10:05 that you realize you're still in exercise mode, you actually have to manually turn on sleep mode. All right, exercise mode. So for this pump, you have to actually manually turn on or off exercise mode. If any of you were at Desi's talk yesterday, she talked a lot about how starting exercise mode or starting the basals, you want to start about 60 to 90 minutes before you exercise. There's much more benefit, particularly from these closed loop systems, to start at least 60 minutes prior to exercise. And what exercise mode does is, again, that target range, instead of it being from 112 to 160, it increases it to 140 to 160. So, and the other thing is it pulls up that bottom. So instead of stopping your insulin if you're predicted to go below 70, it's going to stop your insulin if you're predicted to go below 80. So those are sort of the main features. It's still going to give you the correction boluses if you're predicted to go over 180. So just know that. The other thing that's interesting to know about exercise mode is a lot of people will often give themselves pre-treatment with carbohydrates, right? So you take some carbs like 30 minutes before you go and exercise so that you've got a nice, a higher blood sugar to be able to exercise. What we know with this system, if it sees that rise in your glucose, it is going to start automatically dosing you extra insulin. So we actually want to avoid doing that with these closed loop systems. You can, obviously, if you are hovering down there at 70, 80 in a range where you do not want to start exercise, you probably do want to take some carbohydrates, but you don't want to take sort of the large meal before or anything that's going to sort of be ramping up your glucose levels. So a couple suggestions here is giving yourself smaller amounts of carbohydrates. So one of the things that's often helpful with this system is having something like Gatorade or something that's a fast acting, that if you are a little bit low, you can drink a couple of sips of right at the beginning of exercise, not enough so that it makes your glucose sort of go up, but enough that it sort of sustains you so you're not going down. You can do that sort of throughout exercise, but it's also one of the reasons why you want to have the exercise mode going before you exercise, so that your glucose ideally can sort of naturally drift up into the 140 to 160 range, which is a safer range to start exercising at than starting at, you know, less than 90. Most people find with a little bit of practice, they can get exercise mode to work pretty well for them for most sessions of exercise. So we're talking sort of in that hour or less. Now, last summer, I had the opportunity to go with DYF on the backpacking trip to Mount Whitney with a group of teenagers. So we're putting in, you know, 8 hours of intense exercise a day. This system, I had one of our study kids was on the trip with me. I was pulling my hair out because we could not figure out how to get all of everything to work with the system. And so eventually what we just did is we would, when we were exercising, we would cancel out of Control IQ, we would do a temp basal, and then as soon as we were done exercising, we would go back into closed loop control. Okay, just the last few slides, and then I know, I'm sorry, we got started a little bit later than I had anticipated, so I will give time for more questions at the end. But there's a couple other things to know about Control IQ, is that there are some hardwired alarms that you cannot turn off. You can do things on vibrate, there is that option on the pump, but you can't actually turn these off. So hypoglycemia predicted. So if the pump thinks you're going to go below 70, it is going to alarm you. It's going to go off every 5 minutes until you do something about it. So again, you can acknowledge the alarms. You can say, yes, I'm eating carbs, and then that will pacify the system for at least a little while. Hyperglycemia, why they chose going over 200, I have no idea. This was not the decision of the research teams, but there is a hard alarm that goes off when you are going to go above 200. Now, here is what I have to say about that. If you, to silence this alarm, what you can do is give yourself a manual bolus. So if you say, okay, yes, I know I forgot to give myself a meal bolus and now I'm at 350. I know I'm going to be over 200 for quite some time while it's giving you, having you come down. If you go into the system and you give yourself a manual correction dose, first of all, it's going to give you 100% of what it thinks you need to get down to the target range, and it's also going to silence this alarm. All right, so summary. Just again, the things, meals, the ways that you can sort of change things with the meals is obviously by pre-bolusing, also by using the super bolus, which again is giving additional insulin up front, knowing that it's going to sort of decrease on the back end if you start to come down. Sleep cycle, using it is really important, and extending it 1 hour beyond breakfast is good. For exercise, turning it on 30 to 90 minutes prior to exercising, and don't eat a lot of carbs or anything that's going to make your glucose go up right before exercise. And then the last thing I want to say, because some people I know have issues with disconnections. So one of the tips for that is that if you take your pump and always have it with the glass face side out, so essentially like the screen side out, you will get better connectivity because of where the antenna is that communicates to your Dexcom. That is one of the helpful things that you can do if you deal with a lot of disconnections. Also having it on the same plane as your body, so if you're wearing your Dexcom on your left arm, then wearing your pump on your left hip can be helpful as well. And that is it. Questions?
Dr. Lisa, there are a few questions coming through the chat here. So there's one about, can you just review the example with Mount Whitney and like the exiting the control IQ mode to do a temp basal when exercising for particularly active people?
Yeah, so again, this is something that is more if you're going to be doing sort of long periods of exercise. Because there is no way to do a temp basal, which would be saying like, hey, I want to reduce my basal down, you know, by 80% or by 50%, while control IQ is going. So you actually just need to go into the settings, and I'm sorry I don't have a great way to show this, but you can actually turn off the control IQ, and it will go back to simply a standard pump that has no smart features. You'll still get the Dexcom input, but that is the only thing that sort of will happen. And then saying, okay, I know I'm going to be exercising for the next 2 or 3 hours. I'm going to, again, even if you do a temp basal, it is probably good to start, you know, at least 60 to 90 minutes prior to exercise, and then decreasing that. It is a little bit dependent on person and the type of exercise that you're doing, but going down 50 to 80% on your insulin, the basal insulin during that time, and then just watching it throughout exercise. One of the downsides is for any of you that experienced basal IQ, which was just sort of saying, oh, it's going to stop when your glucose goes low. Once you upgrade to control IQ, you cannot go back to basal IQ. So it will not do the shutting off of insulin when you go low. But does that answer the question? Is there more like sort of specific information I can share about that? And you guys can also just talk. You can unmute yourselves and talk. Scott, I don't know if you're trying to say something, but you're muted at the moment.
I'm now unmuted. Can you now hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, it's all new language and technology, so I'm doing it without hands-on experience. I'm hoping to soon switch over. So that explains some of the gap of me absorbing what you're saying. But by you saying it again, little different words and whatnot, it does help me to understand. And that's without me even seeing the piece of equipment or being familiar to it. I'm preparing myself for that very type of example. And I just got lost a little bit on switching over, changing from, and so anyways, the rewording helped.
So one of the really great things that Tandem has done, if you have a smartphone, they actually have a app that you can download that is all of the functions of their pump. So I don't have the exact link for it, but essentially you can practice with the pump prior to ever having it in your hands. So you can go through all the screens, you can see where the different things are, how to turn things on and off. And that is really helpful. Like if you are thinking about going to a Tandem, a T-Slim that you've never used before, just sort of looking and seeing if you like the functionality. And it's just a nice way to sort of try out their software.
Yeah, that sounds practical. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, and then it looks like, did we get it into the comments?
Yeah, it's the T Simulator app, and it's I don't know if you can see on my here.
Yeah, not great, but yeah.
Yeah, it's just like a little white and blue app, and it looks exactly like the pump interface.
Maybe a generic tech question. Does your phone have to have a certain level of smartness to handle and use? Like I have an old smartphone.
I don't know, actually. Rosa, do you know?
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not too sure. I'm trying to look and see. It doesn't really give any information here. But I
Yeah,
think just
probably
any...
not easily and readily answered question. Yeah, yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
And then
Lisa, do you work out of the Sacramento area?
No, I work out of I'm located close to Stanford.
Oh,
So,
okay. Oh, okay.
But
it looks like...
Dr. Justin, who is the medical director for DYF, he is out of the Sacramento area, and obviously he's great and super knowledgeable about all of this. So if you are looking for somebody who knows a lot about pumps and can guide you through it, he's great.
A good teacher also.
Very.
No, I don't mean to be.
No, he's excellent. I mean, I love going to anything that he does because
you might not be allowed to say otherwise. I'm sort of joking, but what I mean is some people are educated, but that doesn't mean they're a good teacher. Is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no,
in a blunt way.
Yeah.
Can I question about the extending the sleep after breakfast? Okay.
Yes.
So I don't usually do that because I'm about to exercise very soon after breakfast. And even if I don't turn on exercise mode and I just let things go, I will rise after exercise. So you think, is it better for me to just put off the exercise a little while?
Yeah, so that one is hard. It likely would take a lot of sort of playing around with the system. So because we also know that exercise doesn't affect everybody the same.
Right.
So, we know that there's different types of exercise. If you're doing something that is long and sustained, it tends to make people go low, but not everybody. There's a small percentage that it makes go high.
Mm-hmm.
And, versus if you're doing something that's more resistance or weights or sprinting.
That's what it is. Yeah.
Yeah, so that generally causes people to go high.
Mm-hmm.
So for those types of the resistance exercises or anything that you are using more weights, that sort of stuff, I don't actually recommend using the exercise mode.
Okay.
The exercise mode, sorry, I should have said that. Exercise mode is good if you are doing something where you're going to be out walking for an hour, running for an hour, or even running for a shorter amount of time. But it's something where you are doing a sustained activity or going on a bike ride, those kinds of things that generally for most people will drop their glucose levels. But if you're going to be going out and doing a high intensity workout or something, those ones generally cause the glucose level to rise. And so those are exercise mode will not be good for that. So do you ever go low during exercise or do you always just rise?
I do, and that's my other scenario, because if I don't reduce my carbs before dinner and then I go take a walk, I will crash every time. So I don't even know appropriately how much to reduce the carbs even. I've just started skipping the evening walk, which is big fun, but I'm not doing it.
Yeah, so this is also one of these really interesting things. Exercise affects the body differently at different times of the day. So in the morning, people will be more likely to sort of often go higher from exercise. Like people go low more easily from exercise. So you can do things that you can definitely, I would say, I would turn on exercise mode for your evening walks. So that, first of all, I think that it does make sense in that situation because the other thing that is, when you have insulin on board and then go and exercise, it seems to sort of accentuate the amount or the way the insulin works.
Yeah.
So you are more likely to drop low when you've got both exercise and insulin on board. So in that situation, because you have insulin already on board, you can reduce those grams of carbs some, or take a few more if you're going to be going out and walking sort of right after the meal. Because the system already says, oh, you just ate a meal and that's why you're going high. And if you combine that with the exercise mode, so it's aiming for a higher target, it will be at least an hour again before it is going to give you any additional auto corrections from when you gave your food bolus. So,
yeah, it is tricky.
Exercise is really, really tough. Because you can do the same exact things and 3 days you get one result and then the last day you get something different. And I mean, but that's diabetes, right? Like you can do the exact same thing every day and get different results.
I do.
So
it's not just me. Okay.
Okay, so I hate to just cut you off, but there are quite a few other questions and we only have about 10 minutes left. So there's a lot of questions about like what types of insulin you can use with the Tandem pump. What about the FIASP, the new insulin? Yeah, that's the next question.
So in general, this pump is, you can use Humalog and Novolog. Those are the ones that have been approved for the Tandem pump. For FIASP, this is where it gets a little bit sort of, it's hard to sort of make any recommendations. I know people that have used it, with some with really good results and some with not as good results. Some people have found that if they try using FIASP in the pump, then their infusion sets only last for 2 days, and on the third day they need a huge amount of insulin. I also know somebody that tried it for a while and found on the third day her site was just more sensitive and it hurt. So it's one of those things where we say Humalog and Novolog are definitely both okay. If you're using anything besides Humalog and Novolog, that's your own risk.
Okay, and then there's a question about pregnancy, and do you recommend staying on Control IQ in pregnant? I know the awake target range is higher than what would be ideal for pregnancy, and I'm just thinking about my future.
Yeah. So Dr. Marina Bacina is actually giving a talk on pregnancy. I think, I don't remember if she's either later today or tomorrow, so all of my experience with this pump has been in non-pregnant females, because that was actually an exclusion criteria. If you got pregnant, you were out of the study. Just because we know that there's so much more. I would say in general, it would be somewhat challenging because the pump does have a higher range. With women that are pregnant, we are trying to get them down below 140 as their upper bound, and that this pump doesn't do that automatically. So, I think that it probably could be used, but I think that it would be a challenge and something that you would have to talk to an endocrinologist who knows a lot. And Marina Bacina is phenomenal. She is great when it comes to pregnancy and stuff. So she would be somebody to reach out to with that question. And
then, do you know about any updates with user settings, like being able to set a extended bolus for longer than 2 hours, or changing like the target range? So like if 160 doesn't work, you want it to be 140, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so unfortunately, software updates are not as simple as the company saying like, hey, we're gonna, do this nice little update. Software updates actually take a huge amount of work because everything has to go through the FDA. And if the FDA says this is a big enough change, then they have to go back. We have to do additional clinical trials where we try people on these new settings where now we let people adjust things. And so it actually turns into be sort of a pretty big issue. So I do have to say Tandem is fully aware of these issues and the things that people want sort of more ability. But so much of this is, right now we're still talking about first generation pumps. When the Medtronic 670G came out, it was amazing because it was the first thing that happened. Now we're just like, oh my goodness, this was such an early generation. I mean, if you think about the early iPhones or things that they could do, that these first generation pumps the whole goal is like, these need to be safe. And that is what the FDA is focusing on, is safety. And so this pump, the way that it is, it's better than what the 670G was because it has more sort of functionality, but it's still, the goal was safety. And so now that they can amass all of these hours, then they can say, okay, now it's, now we can work beyond safety and work for all these other things. So with that said, some of it will depend on whether or not the FDA needs more trials or not, but they are working on it. Oh,
And
yeah.
then there's a question here about the algorithm's use of user history. I was told I did not use the history at all, but you mentioned the 6-day window. Can you explain that further?
Yeah, so what it uses is your total daily insulin. So it looks at how much insulin between all of your boluses and all of your basal, everything, and that is what it uses. So it's not necessarily looking and saying like, oh, you gave yourself a bolus of 5 units yesterday for your, lunchtime. It doesn't do that, but it does take the entire amount of insulin into account.
And
Can I ask one extra question?
yeah, go for it.
Oh, okay. So then, as far as adjusting your TDD in your settings, I know you're supposed to do it one time when you start up the pump, but is that something you should ever address again, or is it doing it all on its own?
Yeah, no, you should probably never adjust that again because it is more helpful for the pump to know sort of what you've been doing. Now, with the one small caveat on that, and actually I don't know if it will let you even change it without sort of doing some resetting of the entire pump. Would be if you were, like starting a backpacking trip where you basically went from sitting on the couch for the past 5 days to now you're going to be exercising 12 hours a day for the next 5. But other than those sort of like extreme situations, you probably never want to touch that setting.
Okay, thank you. And then on top of that, as far as changing your weight in that same thing, is that something you should ever do?
Yeah, they told you have to.
I would say, yeah, if your weight changes significantly, like by more than probably 10-15%, then changing that, it becomes an option. But otherwise, if it's just sort of like, oh, you went from, whatever weight to 5 pounds more, don't change it.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
And then I'm so sorry if we don't get to all the questions here, but what is your recommendation for bolusing for high-fat meals? Bolus at the time I eat or extend, or bolus using time frames you mentioned?
So for those meals, I probably would bolus either at the time you eat or just a little bit before. If it's a really high-fat meal, I would maybe do only 20% or 30% up front and the rest extended over the 2 hours. I think 2 hours is generally too short. So for a high-fat meal, I would extend it out all the way to the full 2 hours. You probably also want to increase the amount of insulin you're giving. A high-fat meal is probably going to require, somewhere in the range of 20 to 30% more insulin over sort of the long haul. So giving yourself, like you can just sort of calculate, okay, you put in either 30% more carbs or 20% more carbs, or 20% when you dial in the amount of insulin, 20% more insulin, and then using that for your calculation.
Okay. I'm looking through comments. I think that's most of the questions that came through the comments. Does the Tandem have a participant/user forum where someone new to this pump could get more information?
I'm sure they probably do on things like Facebook and that sort of stuff, but I'm not actually, I don't know of any specifically.
Are there any other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask
I'm still
away.
confused on this one part of it that I've had it for over a year now. But like if it says, like right now, it would say 262, and then you push to give a correction for that, it'll suggest that you give so many units. But then if I were to do it manually to put in, it's not the same. And then if I'm going to eat on top of that at the same time, it never adds up the same. So it should be like, I'm thinking if it says you're supposed to put 2.3 units in and then your meal is 3.3, I think it should say like 5.6 would be the total, but it's never that way. So I was trying to figure out if I should bother doing the correction and when I'm going to bolus for the meal, or you can't do both. Because then it'll say, and it also says sometimes, so many times, like if you're supposed to give a correction of 0.3, it'll say you have to wait till 0.5 or something. So,
yeah, so part of that is that you have to realize that it's taking the amount of insulin that you have on board and using that in the calculation. So even though it says, okay, you know, for this glucose, you need this much insulin, it's saying that, oh, well, you've already gotten a unit because we gave an autocorrection or it gave whatever it is. So it's going to be then subtracting that out of those calculations because it takes all of the different factors into account when it gives you that recommendation. And sometimes it will say like, oh, it thinks that you've actually already gotten enough and it won't recommend any sort of a manual calculation or a manual correction.
No,
and so, I mean, you can override those things, but again, it's trying to base it on sort of the amount of insulin that you normally need and all of these different factors. So.
But I'm saying it should be the same. Wouldn't it be if they're giving me correction? If I just did the correction, it would be fine. But then I'm going to eat, and if I just did the eat without having it be the wrong number, it would be. So that's why I don't get that part. And I also don't understand like all these things that happen to it. Like it'll say like fill your tubing after 2 days when you've already had the tubing and you have enough, everything's in there, and you have to use 10 units to make it prove that it's coming through the tubing out of it, and then. And I don't understand how it does that. All of a sudden it does things. And in your very first picture, you showed the picture with the pump and the sensor and different sides of the body. And they always tell me the pump has to be in a direct line with the sensor. And I hate that because I don't have the pocket on that side, or I don't have some way to hold it there. So I like the idea that yours was separate.
Yeah, so it doesn't necessarily have to be. If you're having problems with things disconnecting, then the first thing to do is to put it on the same side of the body, definitely. But otherwise, I'm not sure I totally understand the other part of your question with the not equaling the amount, because there's certain things where if your glucose is too low, they may subtract a little bit of the amount of insulin that you would need. So all of those sort of are the different calculations that it goes into. But I don't know why separating it into two different boluses would be a different amount than giving it as one.
I don't know. And then your software engineer person from Tandem said he's going to figure out that too, because he can't figure that out either.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lisa, and thank you all for joining us today. This is a lot of good information, and we will see you at future sessions.
Yes. Thanks, everyone.